Welcome back to the Hair Cafe Cinematic Universe, hair loss switchers. Remember, a finasteride a day keeps the hair transplant doctor away. So, I am back today to respond to a new video from a familiar face on this channel, Danny Roddy. Danny Roddy recently made a video where he is claiming that hair loss isn't genetic and that it isn't caused by androgens. If this sounds stupid to you, that's because it is, of course, and you may be befuddled as to why I would even bother going after such a low-hanging fruit to begin with. Literally nobody in the hair loss scientific research community believes that androgenetic alopecia is caused by anything other than the genetic sensitivity of hair follicles to DHT. So why am I even bothering making this video, you may wonder? Truth be told, this isn't even my first go around with Danny Roddy and his idiotic convoluted theories about hair loss. Now, I am not trying to come across as nasty here. I don't think Danny is stupid necessarily. Truth be told, I actually kind of like his content just because of how goofy it is. Danny isn't a bad guy, he just strikes me as kind of an eccentric know-it-all. He's kind of like that guy back in high school who would argue with the teacher all day, and you'd hope you'd kill enough time that by the time the bell would ring, the teacher wouldn't find out that you didn't do your homework last night. I made a video about him before, but it has been so long that I made that video that many viewers may not be familiar with it. I'll go ahead and link that video below, but here's just a short summary of what I said in that video. Basically, what happened is Danny Roddy claimed that you can treat hair loss with aspirin, carrot salad, orange juice, and carbon dioxide, and I politely explained to him why he is wrong. No, I'm not even kidding. That's what he really said. Now, it may seem absolutely crazy to most people, and of course, it is crazy, but if you've had any kind of exposure to the community Danny Roddy is part of, then this kind of rhetoric isn't surprising in the slightest. Danny Roddy, he is one of the de facto leaders of the Ray P community. The other de facto leader is Georgy Dinkov, who claims that the way to stop hair loss is to rub topical DHT on your scalp. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what Georgy Dinkov looks like. I rest my case. The Ray P community is basically just this bizarre health cult that follows a fad diet established by the eponymous Ray Pete, who unfortunately died back in 2022. The reason why I say it is bizarre is because it seems to be a weird amalgamation of many different pseudo-scientific health cults. On one hand, followers of the Ray Pete diet demonize seed oils as being the root of virtually all of the health problems we are facing today, and they claim that we should replace unsaturated fats with butter. So at first glance, you may think that the Ray Pete community is some type of low-carb keto or even a carnivore diet analog, but on the contrary, the Ray Pete crowd loves sugar and even recommends consuming large quantities of orange juice or even cane sugar soft drinks like Mexican Coca-Cola. They claim that lots of sugar is good for your health, much the same way many raw vegans do. They also make some health claims about food that aren't supported by any scientific evidence, such as claiming that avocados are carcinogenic when the actual scientific evidence shows that avocados are actually a very healthy food. They also believe in the debunked lectin and plant anti-nutrient theory that purports that lectin content found in plants is toxic, when in reality there is no evidence-based data that lectins as they exist in the food that we actually eat is dangerous. Now, if you were to eat things like raw kidney beans, then you'd probably be consuming a dangerous amount of lectins. But since nobody eats raw kidney beans, that isn't a factor for us at all. Most lectins get broken down while cooking, so therefore it isn't possible for them to be consumed at dangerous levels, and if anything, foods that contain lectins like beans and nightshades are associated with better health outcomes in human beings. So the Ray P community are kind of the odd ducklings of popular online fad diets, but what the Ray P community is probably much better known for is being a dumpster fire of outrageously offensive and over-the-top conspiracy theories that regularly get promoted on their forum. Think of literally any conspiracy theory you have ever heard of in your life or could possibly even imagine, and I guarantee you that you will find a post promoting it on the Ray Pete forums. So I don't know where this all comes from. I know that most of the weird dietary claims come directly from Dr. Pete himself, and I've already shown you some quotes from Dr. Pete's website. Most, if not all, the health claims made by Dr. Pete were proven to be flat out wrong, and it sounds like even he realized that before his death. But health claims aside, I don't know if Dr. Pete embraced some of the other conspiracy theories on the Ray Pete forums, and regardless of what his stance was, I am not going to trash Dr. Pete as the man isn't around anymore to defend himself. Regardless of what Ray Pete may have stood for, he is now gone, and now Danny Roddy has effectively positioned himself as a leading voice, if not the leading voice, of the Ray Pete community. And even though Danny Roddy isn't active himself in the Ray Pete forums, I know for certain he is definitely a conspiracy theorist. How do I know this? Well, When I made my video debunking his claims about aspirin and hair loss, I wasn't sure if he was going to respond, but he actually did respond in the comment section of that video. So out of all the things he could have said in response to me scientifically dismantling him point by point, what he chose to do instead was make a comment claiming that the Apollo missions were fake. So Danny Roddy isn't just a conspiracy theorist, he's also anti-American despite being an American himself. I say that because the Apollo moon landing is the greatest, most historic, and most spectacular scientific achievement in human history. And it also represents the triumph of American freedom over Soviet tyranny. But Danny Roddy, he thinks it was all just a big hoax, and that's all because he can't fathom or comprehend the idea that there were people alive before he was born who were smarter than he is. Never mind the fact that we have lunar satellite surveillance proving that the remnants of the Apollo spacecraft are still on the moon today. I'm sure Danny Roddy will just claim that's a big hoax too, since it comes from NASA. But as it turns out, we actually have third-party evidence from nations like Japan and India. Oh, but those nations are anti-communist, so they likely would have assisted the USA in their propaganda war, right? Well, guess what, chums? Even the Soviet Union tracked the landing in real time and had no suspicions that it was faked. So tell me, Danny, what incentive would the Soviet Union, the nation we were having a Cold War with, have had to help NASA cover up an alleged moon landing hoax? The USSR was the first nation to send a cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Do you think a nation capable of such a tremendous scientific achievement was just too stupid to figure out that the Apollo mission was faked by the USA? Honestly, I am getting a bit sidetracked here. Truth be told, I don't really give a shit about Danny Roddy's opinion on the moon landing at all. The only reason I bring it up, though, is because this is a perfect example of the kind of fringe conspiracy thinking that runs absolutely rampant on the Ray Peat forums. Now, I have no idea if Dr. Ray Peat was as into these conspiracy theories as the forum that carries his name, but if he wasn't, that's really too bad, because Danny Roddy seems to think he is carrying on Dr. Peat's legacy here. Of course, most people don't take any of this weird pseudoscience seriously, and a lot of it is goofy and harmless and even mildly entertaining. That is why I am a bit of a Ray Peat fan myself, to be honest. However, when Danny and his followers start spreading misinformation about hair loss, I feel I need to comment. But I don't want to give you the wrong idea about Danny here. I don't have any malice towards him on a personal level, of course, and I am not making this video to hurt him or his channel. Truth be told, I don't think he represents any kind of threat to the scientific consensus. That would be giving him way too much credit. I'm making this video solely for the purpose of entertainment, because that is what the Ray Peat community is. It is entertainment. It is to science what the Onion is to journalism, so there's no sense in getting all worked up over it. So just sit back, and I hope you all enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to Bioenergetic Basics number 11 with me, Danny Roddy, and today we're going to talk about why baldness is not genetic, and it's definitely not caused by androgens.
Okay, first of all, where in the hell is he filming this from? Is this Donald Trump's gold-plated bathroom in Mar-a-Lago? Did he promise you shelter from the storm, Danny? You know, Donald Trump believes the moon landing was real, right? He even made remarks commemorating the 50th anniversary of the moon landing while he was president. So are you sure that's someone you want to associate with?
The True Method of Knowledge is Experiment by William Blake, in memory of Ray Peat, raypeat.com. This episode is brought to you by my course, which you can find on Patreon and Gumroad, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Okay, so first we get a quick quote from the English poet William Blake touting the role of experimentation as the true method of knowledge, followed immediately by a quick commercial for Danny's online courses. Of course, I clicked on the links and found this course here on Bioenergetics Basics, which costs $149. There's also a link to Danny's monthly coaching calls where you can talk on Zoom with Danny once a month for $129 per month or twice a month for $199 per month. Okay, I don't blame the guy for trying to make a living here, but you can already find plenty of bullshit on the internet for free, so why pay this type of money for it? Anyways, as we'll soon see, Danny is going to completely ignore or at least misinterpret William Blake's advice, because Danny's idea of experimentation is not to analyze experiments that prove his point. No, not at all. Instead, Danny is going to fire off a whole bunch of quotes from studies that superficially seem to back up his claims. In reality, though, he is taking quotes out of context and is deliberately misinterpreting these quotes. This is pure gish galloping, where the viewer is just buried under such a massive pile of bullshit that it is simply too overwhelming to refute. Gish galloping, for those who don't know, is a dishonest debate tactic that is often deployed by pseudo-intellectuals and con artists that is used to prove an argument by overwhelming opponents to the argument with an excessive number of arguments, but with no regard for the accuracy or strength of any of those arguments. Danny knows that the quality of his arguments are poor, so he tries to use quantity to compensate for it. Danny never actually explains the experiments behind any of these quotes, or the fact that most of them don't even come from experimental data at all. Instead, they usually come from the discussion sections of papers where authors are speculating about certain mechanistic steps that haven't been fully worked out yet. But to Danny, if not every last detail of a mechanism for hair loss has been worked out yet, then he'll jump to the conclusion that the whole mechanism must be wrong. Refuting Danny's tedious gish galloping is a strong reminder of Brandolini's law. Brandolini's law, also known as the bullshit asymmetry principle, was an observation made by an Italian programmer named Alberto Brandolini, who noticed that it is much easier to spew bullshit online than to refute it. Quoting him directly, he said, quote, "The amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it," unquote. That's of course absolutely true. Danny Roddy doesn't make any effort to qualify any of his arguments with evidence-based data. He just says everything with a large enough degree of confidence that he's hopeful his viewers will just accept what he has to say at face value. I, on the other hand, I am left with the unenviable task of actually having to explain why his arguments are complete bullshit, which is going to take far more effort and time than what Danny put into his video. Hence why these response videos sometimes take a while to make, and it's also why I kind of hate making response videos to begin with. But let's go ahead and grab our shovels and see just how deeply we can wade into Danny Roddy's bullshit before the stench becomes unbearable.
So let's get to the steelman of the genetic androgen hypothesis. And this is a paper in 2016 by Rinaldi. And they say testosterone converted to the more active metabolite dihydrotestosterone through the work of the enzyme 5-alpha reductase plays a determinant role in the onset of hair loss in genetically susceptible individuals. And in 2010, Trueb, his book, Aging Hair, he has a graphic. And here we have an image displaying that androgens are somehow affecting the hair follicle with question marks. And so there are hypotheses that the androgens are causing oxidative stress. And if you're in the Ray-Peat bioenergetic world, you know that reductive stress precedes oxidative stress. However, I just picked this graphic to show that the theory of how this is happening is complete conjecture. And it has never been finished or offered some plausible explanation of how androgens are specifically attacking and causing the hair follicles to become smaller over time.
So he presents as a steelman hypothesis what is accepted by literally 100% of all scientists. Specifically, it's the fact that DHT, dihydrotestosterone, plays a detrimental role in the onset of hair loss in genetically susceptible individuals. Just in case you haven't heard of it, a steelmanning is the opposite of a strawmanning. With strawmanning, you argue against a position that your opponent doesn't actually hold. With steelmanning, on the other hand, you are supposed to present the strongest case that your opponent holds, and then you say why it is wrong. Of course, Danny doesn't steelman at all in this video. He completely avoids discussing any of the overwhelming scientific evidence that baldness is caused by DHT in genetically susceptible individuals. Instead, he just shows a figure from a book that he says is by Dr. Ralph Trueb, while in actuality, it is this book here which was edited by Dr. Trueb and actually contains chapters written by many different authors. But it's definitely ironic that Danny Roddy is bringing up Dr. Trueb to make his argument, since Dr. Trueb is one of the most well-known hair loss researchers in the entire world, and he would be the first to laugh at Danny Roddy's attempt to link his name to Danny's pseudoscience. I'm sure Dr. Trueb would want absolutely nothing to do with this contrarian, attention-seeking ideologue. So, what is Danny's big proof that DHT doesn't play a role in hair loss? Well, get this. His evidence is the fact that there is a figure in this book, which by the way is about hair aging and not about androgenetic alopecia, and the figure just so happens to have some question marks on it. Yes, the fact that there exists a figure with question marks on it absolutely disproves the role of DHT in causing hair loss. But wait a minute here, what about this figure here that I just found that shows how DHT interacts with the androgen receptor and the WNT-Wnt pathway in great detail? But wait just another moment here, chooms, because it turns out there is a question mark on this figure too. So I guess Danny Roddy is right. As long as people are drawing figures with question marks on them, the whole DHT plus genetics theory of androgenetic alopecia has to be thrown completely out the window.
So the steel man that I just mentioned of male pattern baldness is regurgitated over and over and over again. It's DHT, bro, or it's your genes, et cetera, et cetera. But some people might be shocked and find out that there are many papers talking about baldness as an unsolved medical problem in 2014, 15, and 16.
Okay, hold your horses here, chooms, because here comes the worst example of gish galloping I have ever seen in my entire life.
So here we have a 2016 paper by Goffin, and they say treatment of hair loss is still an unmet need. Drugs such as finasteride and androgen pathway inhibitor are used for the treatment of androgenic hair loss, androgenic alopecia. These treatments have side effects. Finasteride causes libido loss and impotence in men. Glucocorticoids cause diabetes, weight gain, osteoporosis. And the problem of treating hair loss is far from being solved.
Okay, this is a perfectly good example of Roddy twisting sentences into completely different meanings than what the authors had intended. If you read what the authors actually say, they're not saying the mechanism of hair loss has not been solved. They are saying the treatment of hair loss is still an unmet need. To quote them directly, they say, quote, "The problem of treating hair loss is far from being solved," unquote. They are complaining that the treatments of androgenic alopecia have side effects, not that they didn't work.
And another one by Jane in 2014, they say, till date, only 2 FDA-approved synthetic drugs, minoxidil and finasteride, are used to cure androgenic alopecia with only 35 and 48% success, respectively. Therefore, a search for a new drug based on the mechanism of androgen action is still needed. It is unlikely that single targeted agents will be sufficient for treating androgenic alopecia, and therefore it would be a challenge to obtain compounds with multiple activities.
Well, again, I can easily quibble about the success rates given in this article, which are on the low side, particularly for finasteride, but these authors are not denying that androgenic alopecia is caused by androgens. They even say that a search for a new drug based on the mechanism of androgenic action is still needed. They are affirming that new drugs need to target the effects of androgens on the hair follicle or on the downstream effects of androgens in the hair follicles. They are not denying that finasteride works, and we know that finasteride's sole action on the hair follicles is to decrease DHT levels. Not only that, but if you look at the actual article that this quote comes from, this one right here, you can see that Roddy is completely misrepresenting the position of the authors. The authors specifically state that the mechanism of androgenic alopecia is the overproduction of DHT. But this is something Danny does over and over again in this video. He takes quotes completely out of context and completely misrepresents them.
This is from Brajak, also in 2014, and they say recent years have witnessed a considerable progress in the research focused on treatment of hair disorders, but with limited success. Therefore, one of the prime challenges of modern hair research is a more profound understanding of the molecular controls of hair follicle cycling. Common diseases such as alopecia areata, telogen effluvium, and androgenic alopecia until then will remain unsolved medical problems.
Well, again, this is not research. This is an opinion, and the author is talking about not just androgenic alopecia, but also alopecia areata and telogen effluvium. The point the author is trying to make here is that more research is needed to completely understand all the molecular events involved in the hair cycle, and if we had such a complete understanding, we could develop better treatments for all types of hair loss conditions. But this author is not saying that no progress has been made in understanding the hair cycle. In fact, the article itself goes into great detail on all the biological pathways that have been worked out that are involved in the hair cycle. It is completely disingenuous for Danny to use this article as evidence against DHT causing hair loss. Case in point, here's a direct quote from the article. Quote, "Dihydrotestosterone-driven alterations are believed to be key factors involved in male pattern baldness," unquote. Real scientists will always admit that there are gaps in our knowledge, and that's because scientific research is meant to be falsifiable. It's not meant to be treated like gospel. However, pseudoscientists like Roddy will see things like this, and they'll be like, "Huh? See? They're admitting that they don't know what's going on, so their theories are wrong, and my completely made-up theories must be right, so huh."
So why is it an unsolved medical problem? We don't have time to get into it too much, but I think Merck ruined pattern baldness research. I don't think it would be as bad as it is now if Merck hadn't gotten involved. And that is a long story, and it's in this article from 1992 called Keeping the Pipeline Filled at Merck. I'll just read a little bit here. They say, every company has its legends. At Merck & Company, the latest is about Proscar, the new drug that shrinks enlarged prostates and is awaiting government approval. It involves a remote Caribbean mountain village with a population of male pseudohermaphrodites and an obscure medical paper about them.
So I guess he thinks he's already proven that hair loss is an unsolved medical problem, because the next thing he does is blame it all on Merck. He quotes from a non-scientific article on Merck's development of finasteride, where he mocks a supposedly obscure paper referring to a remote Caribbean mountain village with a population of male pseudohermaphrodites. Yeah, good one, Danny. I'm sure that research is all completely worthless, right? Or maybe Danny Roddy should actually read the famous paper by Dr. Julian Imperato-McGinley that described families of men in the Dominican Republic who were born with a genetic abnormality that caused them to lack the type 2 5-air isoenzyme. As a result of that genetic mutation, they ended up with very low DHT levels throughout their lives. But most importantly, they all never went bald. This was the key finding that led to Merck's development of finasteride, which blocks the type 2 5-air isoenzyme, which converts testosterone into DHT. Maybe, and this is just me guessing here, but just maybe the real reason Danny doesn't want to go into this article is because it shows that hair growth is influenced by genetics and by androgens, which completely goes against his fake theories.
I don't think finasteride works by inhibiting androgens. I think it has a different mechanism, but there's really no reason to not trust Merck. They're a good company aside from ruining pattern baldness research.
So he says, without any evidence as usual, that he doesn't think finasteride works by inhibiting androgens. He thinks it has some different mechanism which he doesn't describe or provide any evidence for whatsoever. But after mocking Merck, he ends up saying there's no reason not to trust Merck, and that they're actually a good company aside from his belief that they're ruining hair loss research.
Okay, so let's talk about the second thing that I think is a huge problem, is the idea that masculinity was the real problem with pattern baldness.
Okay, so he next launches into the longest section of the video, and I'm not sure how to best handle it, mostly because it makes absolutely zero sense. He calls this section Masculinity Bias. I hate to skim over it because I think he is actually convinced that this is the central part of his theory, but it is completely nonsensical. So instead, let me just show you some excerpts from it.
Because in 1942, James B. Hamilton, he's the guy that is probably the father of the idea that androgens cause baldness. And he was the first one to demonstrate in male castrates that if they were castrated at a certain age, they would never go bald. But even he did not seem as certain as people later that androgens were responsible for hair loss. And so here in 1942, he's saying the quantities of androgens prerequisite for baldness need not exceed those secreted by the testes of young adult males and are probably less in at least some instances.
So he starts quoting from James B. Hamilton, who actually is a well-known character in the Hair Cafe cinematic universe, also known as the HCU. So Danny totally misinterprets this quote from Dr. Hamilton's 1942 paper, which by the way is titled, quote, "Male hormone stimulation is prerequisite and an incitant in common baldness," unquote. Dr. Hamilton is one of the first scientists to show that male hormones, meaning androgens, are what cause male pattern baldness, which is exactly contrary to what Danny is claiming. In the quote Danny shows here, Dr. Hamilton is just saying that it doesn't take excessive amounts of androgens to cause baldness. It just takes the normal amounts that are secreted by young male adults, or even less than that. Dr. Hamilton is simply saying that men who go bald don't have high circulating androgen levels, which is true. But it is a total distortion of Dr. Hamilton's position to use this quote to claim that androgens aren't the cause of androgenic alopecia. Dr. Hamilton did not have any doubt about the fact that androgens cause androgenic alopecia, but even if he were raising questions about the mechanism, that would be okay. Remember, this was back in 1942, and back then, DHT hadn't even been discovered yet. Scientists are always seeking new evidence and will admit that there are always more questions to answer. That's in direct contrast to pseudoscientists like Danny Roddy, who will take any unknowns in the mechanisms behind hair loss as an excuse to say that no one understands how hair loss works and that all the theories are wrong. Bullshit. Anyways.
There is as yet, however, no proof that common baldness or unusually rapid loss of hair is caused by excessive quantities or unusual types of androgens. And also, the suspicion arises that androgens are not the directly causative agent in baldness, but only one member, albeit a frequently effective one, of a family of remote causes that affect local areas capable of reacting in a special manner.
So he's quoting more from Dr. Hamilton. Let's go ahead and put this quote into context, which is something Danny Roddy never does, of course. In this paper, Dr. Hamilton injected 4 hypogonadal or castrated men with replacement doses of testosterone. So basically, what we would now call testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT. These men had full heads of hair before TRT, but then subsequently, they went bald after treatment with testosterone. The amount of testosterone that these men received was equal to or less than what a normal man secretes, but they still went went bald nevertheless. Dr. Hamilton notes that all these men had relatives who were bald as well. So what Dr. Hamilton is saying here is that there is a genetic component to baldness, but that is not enough. You also have to add in androgens, but you don't need an excessive amount of testosterone in order to cause baldness. What is missing from the equation here, though, is DHT, but that's not Dr. Hamilton's fault. Dr. Hamilton couldn't possibly have known about DHT in 1942 because it was only in 1956 that DHT was discovered to be a byproduct of testosterone in the body. So naturally, Dr. Hamilton speculates that there is some other factor involved in hair loss. And there is another factor. It is the trash hormone DHT.
And finally, Hamilton mentions estrogen as a possibility. So he says, decrease in androgenic secretion can be attained upon administering estrogens, either as a result of inhibiting gonadotropic secretions or possible by direct antagonism between androgens and estrogens. But estrogens in themselves have been demonstrated to prevent the proper growth of hair. I think James B. Hamilton was doing the best that he could, given that it was 1942.
So this comes from the section of Dr. Hamilton's paper where he's talking about possible treatments for baldness. He half-jokingly says that castration at an early age would work, but the treatment is worse than the disease. He says another possible treatment would be to use estrogens in order to inhibit androgens, but I would also say that would be a case where the treatment would be worse than the disease, at least for men who don't want to transition into women. But then he makes this curious statement, which is that estrogens themselves have been shown to prevent the proper growth of hair. Well, that seems to go directly against the fact that women usually have good hair despite having higher estrogen levels than men, and also the fact that men who transition to women by taking estrogen will often experience remarkable hair growth, as we see on subreddits like trans timelines. So I went ahead and looked up the article that Dr. Hamilton cites while making this claim. It's this article here from 1940. As you can see from this quote from the article, the investigators noticed hair loss in dogs injected with what they describe as massive doses of estrogen. Poor dogs. So Danny Roddy is implying that estrogen plays a causative role in male hair loss, but one thing that men don't have is massive amounts of estrogen. Unless, of course, you're Jason Blaha. So Danny Roddy, like many of the denizens of the Rape Pete community, are hung up on the idea of DHT being an amazing masculinizing hormone and estrogen being an evil feminizing hormone, so they would like to blame hair loss on estrogen, of course, and he then goes off into a little tangent about estrogen stimulating the adrenals and increasing dehydroepiandrosterone, otherwise known as DHEA, but he talks about DHEA in depth later on in the video, so I'll wait until that part in the video to address that specifically.
And so this paper by Ditkoff supports what I'm talking about here. So they say, in conclusion, these data provide evidence that estrogen is at least one factor that influences adrenal androgen sensitivity and PCOS and may help explain the frequent finding of adrenal hyperandrogenism in this syndrome.
So I think he is claiming here that estrogens are playing a role in male baldness, but he quotes this paper that deals with women who have what's called polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. These women have elevated estrogen and elevated androgen levels, and they often have obesity and hirsutism, meaning excessive hair growth. The paper claims that the excessive androgens in this syndrome come from the adrenal glands, which develop an increased sensitivity to ACTH due to increased estrogen levels. PCOS, of course, has nothing at all to do with androgenetic alopecia. So I think Danny is just trying to confuse the issue here, and he's implying that somehow estrogen is related to hair loss. So he goes on with more about estrogen.
And here's another one from Constance R. Martin in 1985. And she says, it was found that estrogens mimic testosterone, whereas DHT does not. The conclusion that estrogens are defeminizing agents is supported by several findings.
So again, this is wildly out of context. The textbook he is quoting from is discussing a very specific topic, namely about what causes masculinization during brain development after birth. It has nothing at all to do with adult hair loss. Also, if you look at the quote, the author is saying that estrogen is actually a defeminizing agent, which means it is not causing feminization, which is exactly the opposite of what Danny is trying to claim. It's completely off topic, but the author of the quote is looking at a theory based on rat studies that in newborns, testosterone is converted into estrogen in neurons in the brain by aromatase in those neurons, and this actually triggers defeminization of the brain, not testosterone or DHT. I mean, that's interesting, of course, and maybe a little counterintuitive, but it has nothing at all to do with hair loss in adults. It's just another quote taken out of context that doesn't even support what Danny is trying to prove.
So another very important aspect of this masculinity bias is that testosterone can be aromatized into estrogen, especially under stress. So this article from 2002, they say in males, testosterone is the major source of plasma estradiol, the main biologically active estrogen, only 20% of which is secreted by the testes. Of the factors influencing plasma estradiol levels, plasma testosterone is a major determinant. However, the age-associated decrease in testosterone levels is scarcely reflected in plasma estradiol levels as a result of increasing aromatase activity with age and the age-associated increase in fat mass.
Okay, once again, Danny is misinterpreting a study. If you look at the actual study and not just take some misleading quotes from the PubMed abstract like Danny is doing, you see that in the study, plasma estradiol levels do decrease with age, but what the authors are trying to explain here is that they don't decrease as much as you might expect because of increases in aromatase activity and body fat that typically occur with age. But estradiol levels actually decrease with age. So even though Danny is trying to blame hair loss with age on increasing estrogen levels, that isn't what's actually happening because estrogen levels drop with age.
So here's the greatest paper I've seen in the last few years. This is from 2020. An alternative potential androgen-independent mechanism for female pattern hair loss phenotype deserves to be carefully considered, as well as a rethinking the identifying term of this type of baldness in estrogenic alopecia.
Okay, so here's the greatest paper Danny has seen in the last few years. It is a single case report of a phenotypical woman with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome who has female pattern hair loss. I'll explain what this is in a moment, but later on Danny brings out the only other case report in the literature, and I don't know why he doesn't discuss both cases here, but let me tackle both of these cases right now. People with androgen insensitivity syndrome have the X and Y chromosomes of men, but have a mutation of the androgen receptor so that they are partially or even completely insensitive to androgens. So they end up being virtually indistinguishable from females, though they are infertile and their internal sex organs are actually testes. So they actually have levels of testosterone similar to men, or even higher levels than men do, while their estrogen levels are very low on the other hand. But the testosterone has no effect on them because the androgen receptors are absent or they don't work at all. So in this case report, the woman with androgen insensitivity syndrome had what appeared to be female pattern hair loss, and she was treated with 5% topical minoxidil along with a whole lot of other treatments, including low-level laser light therapy and injections of a bunch of amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins and minerals, flavonoids, and antioxidants. Her hair did improve, and I'm sure it was just from the minoxidil alone and not any of the other garbage that she got, though I have to say in this photo where the before treatment is on the left and the after is on the right, her hair is parted a little differently in the photo on the right, but that's beside the point here. Anyways, so the point the article is trying to make, and the point Danny is trying to make, is that female pattern hair loss can't be due to androgens because this woman was completely insensitive to androgens, yet she was still losing her hair. So haha, I guess. So it is interesting to me that Danny chose to emphasize this case report because, like I said, there is another case report in the medical literature on the same subject, which Danny does mention later on without apparently realizing the connection between these case reports. It is a similar case, but the authors are more skeptical that this type of case disproves that androgens cause female pattern hair loss, and they're not at all saying that this case raises any questions about the causes of hair loss in men. They actually say that while the cause of female pattern hair loss is less established than the cause of male pattern hair loss, there's no question that male pattern hair loss is due to androgens. They say, quote, "Male balding is undoubtedly an androgen-dependent trait, and it has been assumed that female pattern hair loss has a similar etiology," unquote. They then talk about the fact that men with partial insensitivity to androgens actually have less hair loss than men with normal androgen receptors. They reference this interesting paper by Dr. Roddy Sinclair. It is about men with a syndrome called Kennedy syndrome. These men have a partial defect of the androgen receptor, and the paper shows that men with this reduction of androgen receptor function have a reduced incidence of androgenic alopecia. So why would someone with completely absent androgen receptors develop hair loss, you may wonder? Well, one possibility is that the androgen receptors might not be totally non-functional. The researchers who wrote this case report note that circulating testosterone and DHT levels were very high in these women. So if there was any residual androgen receptor functionality, it could cause typical androgenic alopecia. It's also possible that the hair loss in both these cases was due to another cause. The point is that these two cases at most raise questions about the causes of female pattern hair loss in women, but they don't at all suggest that there is something other than androgens that causes male pattern hair loss in men.
So let's talk about another thing that throws people for a loop, but I think this is a very important element of the argument that stress and low metabolism is actually causing pattern baldness. But there's a series of papers talking about elevated DHEA or dihydroepiandrosterone, what we talked about earlier. And let's just read through these real quick and then talk about it. This paper from Pitts in 1987, they say 18 men aged 18 to 32 with rapidly progressive male pattern baldness had serum dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate and testosterone measured. DHEA sulfate levels were elevated in all patients. This study adds evidence to the possibility that hyperadrenalism may be an important element in the complex biochemistry of male pattern baldness.
So Danny's trying to claim that stress stimulates the adrenal glands and that this is what is causing hair loss. He mentions a small study of just 18 men with early onset androgenic alopecia, and the researchers found elevated DHEAS levels compared to a control group of 7 men of a similar age without hair loss. So aside from the fact that this was a very small study with a very small control group, as well as the fact that the study didn't even bother measuring DHT levels at all, this study does nothing to disprove the androgen hypothesis whatsoever. First of all, while stress can cause hair shedding in the form of telogen effluvium, it does not cause androgenic alopecia, and I went over all this in my video on stress and hair loss, which I'll link below. It's also well established that hair loss, particularly very premature hair loss, causes life stress in individuals, and I'll link the video that explains that below too. But even if stress elevated DHEA and DHEAS, I should remind Danny that DHEA and DHEAS are both androgenic hormones, and they are precursors to both testosterone and DHT. These are obviously not estrogenic hormones at all, and the authors of the study doubt neither the genetic component of androgenic alopecia nor the fact that androgens are directly responsible for it. Here are 2 quotes from the article. Quote, although genetic determination is now well established, the actual expression of male pattern baldness may be generated by the action of excessive amounts of androgens on hair follicles of susceptible individuals. This finding of elevated serum dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate in 18 men with male pattern baldness is in agreement with the current understanding of androgen metabolism in alopecia, unquote.
Here's another one from 1981. So before that, they said no correlation was found between the condition and circulating serum androgen levels. Urinary steroid measurements, however, established a positive correlation between the degree of male pattern alopecia and the level of dihydroepiandrosterone, and also indicated a large number of patients had mild hyperadrenal activity.
Well, this study from 1981 contradicts the study he just showed in that there was no increase in DHEA levels in men with male pattern baldness. Also, this is another old study that didn't measure DHT levels because at the time the study was written, it still wasn't appreciated that DHT played a role in androgenic alopecia. Actually, there are many studies showing no correlation between serum androgen levels and the incidence of androgenic alopecia. It's not surprising that there isn't a good correlation between serum androgen levels and male pattern baldness, and that's because most people with androgenic alopecia actually have normal serum levels of testosterone and DHT. It is the scalp DHT that is elevated, and that is what is important. So please guys, for the millionth time, stop getting blood work. It's completely fucking useless. However, it is worth mentioning that there may be some men who have the male equivalent of polycystic ovarian syndrome who have elevated androgenic hormones that trigger early onset androgenic alopecia, as well as some other metabolic problems, and there are some studies supporting this. However, it makes sense that anything increasing androgen levels, including taking exogenous testosterone or DHT, would make androgenic alopecia worse, and that's because the end result would be increased DHT in the hair follicles, unless a 5-AR inhibitor is used, of course. So none of this research Danny is citing does anything to disprove the well-established androgen hypothesis that Danny is so skeptical of.
And then finally, the same thing is found in women. So they say the serum adrenal androgen dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate ranged from 2.2 to 5.8 micrograms per milliliter. And the normal female range was 0.3 to 3.2. All women had normal serum testosterone level, of 2 women with elevated levels of serum prolactin.
So it is clear Danny Roddy is stuck in the 1980s. So next up is this paper here from 1983. It is another study of women with female pattern hair loss. Elevated levels of DHEAS were found in the study. So again, this is an increase in androgen levels. In fact, in a figure from the study, you can see that the metabolism of DHEAS leads right to DHT. The authors didn't measure DHT levels directly, but they do say, quote, apparently DHEAS is hydrolyzed to dihydroepiandrosterone and subsequently converted to more potent androgens, unquote. Keep in mind that Danny is relying very heavily on studies published in the 1980s. This was back when the central role of DHT was not yet as widely known as it is today, so researchers were definitely aware aware that androgens were involved in hair loss, but they didn't know yet which one was specifically the culprit. Also, a lot of the research he quotes involves female pattern hair loss where there is a lot less research. He completely ignores all the research clearly establishing the role of DHT in the causation of male pattern hair loss. It's also funny that he leaves hanging the last quote on this slide about 2 women with elevated levels of serum prolactin. The full quote is, quote, "Of 2 women with elevated levels of serum prolactin, one had a pituitary adenoma as revealed by computed tomography," unquote. Why he put half of that quote on his slide is anyone's guess, but oh well, let's go ahead and hear some more.
So what is going on here? Isn't DHEA one of the youth-associated hormones? Isn't it supposed to be high? Isn't that good? I think the idea behind that will be explained by these next references. So Roddy et al. Were the first people to speak of the detailed parallelisms between the function of thyroid hormone and the action of DHEA. In that regard, the key relationship between thyroid action and DHEA is they both stimulate thermogenesis. In relation to DHEA as an anti-aging hormone, we have to consider its potential as a stress-modulating steroid. DHEA has an adrenocortical stress-mediated blocking action. These data show that DHEAS concentrations increase in response to both acute and chronic repeated stress and provide another measure of HPA activity that parallels cortisol during acute response to stress, but diverges in chronic or repeated stress.
So I don't know what he's trying to say here, but it sounds like a lot of double talk to me. I get the feeling that he thinks DHEA or DHEAS, which are 2 distinct steroids that he uses interchangeably, that they are both manly virile hormones, and thus they are therefore good hormones because they have something to do with thyroid hormone and stress. He says DHEA is an anti-aging hormone, but he just claimed that it was associated with hair loss, so I really can't make any logical sense about what he's trying to say here. Anyways, let's go ahead and hit the play button and see what he has to say next.
The masculinity angle here is a huge problem. I think these side things that are rarely talked about, from estrogen to DHEA, provide actual clues of what's happening. And the idea that testosterone can be aromatized to estrogen, which is talked about very infrequently, I think to move along in the pattern baldness research and to discard the genetic androgen hypothesis needs to be jettisoned.
So apparently it's the side things that are rarely talked about, like estrogen, DHEA, aromatase, thyroid, stress, etc. That's where the action really is. And all the evidence for the androgen genetic hypothesis, which he completely ignored, needs to be completely thrown out the window. Sorry, I'm not convinced at all.
So let's talk about the next reason that hair loss is not genetic, and it's definitely not caused by androgens. It's that, and anybody with eyes can tell you that this is true, that it's extremely pervasive. And we're going to get to some shocking quotes. So here we go, in terms of saying there's a genetic susceptibility to baldness, because everybody knows there is an inheritance of baldness. I'm not debating that. I'm just saying how that inheritance is happening.
Okay, the first 2 parts of the video were definitely weird, but here's where things get really bizarre. So here Danny Roddy is starting a new section of the video called Extremely Pervasive. His basic argument here seems to be that since male pattern baldness is very common, it can't be genetic. That's absolutely absurd, and it almost sounds like the kind of rationale someone who believes in intelligent design would use. That's like saying because brown hair and brown eyes are common, they can't be genetic, even though these traits are definitely genetic and everybody knows it. But then, shockingly, he completely contradicts himself and says, quote, "Everybody knows there's an inheritance of baldness. I'm not debating that," unquote. You're not debating that? You could have fooled me there, Danny. I thought you said baldness wasn't genetic. But then he says what he is really debating is how the inheritance of baldness is actually happening. So, believe it or not, Danny Roddy is about to challenge Darwin. But first, he quotes a few more studies just to confuse things even further.
And even Hamilton in 1951, he said these genetic, endocrine, and aging factors are interdependent. No matter how strong the inherited predisposition to baldness, alopecia will not result if inciting agents such as androgens are missing. So in his castrates and eunuchs, it didn't matter how strong the familial inheritance was in their families. If they were castrated, they would never develop baldness. It kind of makes the genetic susceptibility angle a moot point, and it will become even more of a moot point after I read the next few references.
I don't understand why Danny thinks this advances his case. What Dr. Hamilton is saying is that even if there is a family history, you don't get baldness in castrated men who are castrated at an early age. This is perfectly in line with the fact that you need both genetics and androgens in order to develop androgenic alopecia. If you take away the androgens, you don't get baldness despite having the genetics. If you don't have the genetics, you don't get baldness either despite the androgens. What's so difficult to understand here?
I see so often, oh, it's genetic, it's genetic, it's genetic, but it's really a way of saying absolutely nothing. And here we have the godfather of the androgen hypothesis of baldness saying that it's basically a non-issue.
Dr. Hamilton isn't saying that at all. Yeah, sure, maybe it's a non-issue provided you're okay with getting yourself castrated, otherwise genetics are an issue, obviously.
One of my favorite references from 1996 by Guerrero, they say, as androgenic alopecia is a very common condition and displays a large variety in the rate of progression, apparently normal people may be in fact in early stages of baldness. And Trueb in 2010, they also say, although there is no precise statistics, the incidence of male pattern baldness in Caucasians is often quoted as approaching 100%.
Okay, young people in the early stages of androgenic alopecia may appear to have healthy hair even though the process has already started. So what? It takes several cycles of miniaturization before hair loss is noticeable. As far as the quote from Dr. Trueb, it isn't actually from Dr. Trueb. It is from a book chapter in a book Dr. Trueb edited. It's this chapter here by Valerie Randall. In this chapter, Dr. Randall is quoting various sources on the incidence of hair loss. Of course, as usual, Danny omits half of the quote. The full quote is, quote, although there are no precise statistics, the incidence in Caucasians is often quoted as approaching 100%. Others suggest that about half of men and women above 40 exhibit androgenic alopecia, unquote. Dr. Randall goes on to note that the incidence of androgenic alopecia varies in different racial and ethnic groups, and then says, quote, the reason for this racial variation is unclear, but is probably genetic because differences appear to be retained regardless of location, unquote. So Danny, like usual, is using partial quotes falsely attributed to Dr. Trueb in order to imply that Dr. Trueb is casting doubt on the genetic origin of androgenic alopecia. Anyone who has read anything by Dr. Trueb knows that he is a strong proponent of the fact that genetics combined with DHT is the cause of androgenic alopecia.
So as for how baldness is developing through inheritance, I think we got to turn to Lysenko. And this is from a book, 1966, Cold War in Biology by Carl Lindgren. And I'll just read some quotes by him. But he says, knowing the course of construction of the heredity of an organism, it is possible to vary it directively by means of production of specific conditions at a specific moment of the development of an organism. And he also says, heredity is the effect of concentrations of the action of external conditions assimilated by the organism in a series of preceding generations. And Luther Burbank, who apparently said this 50 years before him, said it in a way more simple way. He said, heredity is the sum of all past environments. And so your parents, their grandparents, your transgenerational history, you're accumulating their environment and their health. If they have some susceptibility to some illness, if that is not broken within the chain of passing down a physiological inheritance to the offspring, that's going to continue. It can just take being in a better environment, better nutrition, supplementation, etc., to break the chain of events and improve not only that generation, but future generations. Also in Cold War in Biology, they say towards the end here, the Russian Lysenkoists who claim that the nucleus is a purely epigenetic structure continually resynthesized by the cytoplasm.
All right, I'm going to have to cut him off here because this isn't just wrong, it's also offensive. This is where Danny's video goes off the rails completely. He brings up the Soviet biologist Trofim Lysenko and his completely debunked theories of evolution. Basically, Lysenko rejected Darwinian evolution. In fact, he didn't even believe in the existence of genes. Instead, his beliefs were a variant of what's called Lamarckian evolution. Lamarckian evolution was a theory of evolution that predated Darwin. It is the belief that an organism can pass on to its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquired throughout its lifetime. So, for example, say someone works out a lot and gets really strong. According to Lamarckian evolution, you will then pass on that strength to your offspring. So, Lamarckian evolution stopped being a serious theory over 160 years ago when Darwin published The Origin of Species. Darwin showed that acquired traits don't alter genes and that what drove evolution was random mutations of the genes and survival of the fittest. However, during the Soviet era, Marxists felt that the idea that evolution was driven by random mutations went against the Marxist concept of the immutable laws of history. And so Lysenko in the 1920s rejected Darwinism, natural selection, and the gene theory. Unfortunately, one of Lysenko's biggest fans was Joseph Stalin, so Lysenkoism became an official dogma in the Soviet Union. Because of Lysenko's bizarre theories, Soviet agricultural practices were dramatically changed, and the Soviet Union went from being a productive agricultural nation to having food shortages that cost the lives of millions of innocent people. Not only that, his practices were adopted by Mao Zedong in China, which resulted in millions of deaths from famine in China as well. Here's a quote from Wikipedia. Quote, According to the Atlantic writer Sam Kean, Lysenko gutted it and by some accounts set Russian biology and agronomy back a half century. Lysenko's work was eventually recognized as fraudulent by some, but not before he had wrecked the lives of many and destroyed the reputation of Russian biology, according to scientist Peter Gluckman, unquote. It's also ironic that the whatever Danny is quoting from here, if you look at the non-highlighted text, clearly the author thinks that Lysenko is completely full of shit. So, the mystery has been solved. Roddy doesn't believe hair loss is related to genetics, and that's because he doesn't believe in genetics to begin with. He believes that you can start out with a full head of hair, but then if you eat the wrong diet and end up with too much estrogen or too much DHEA or whatever the fuck he likes to claim, not only will you lose your hair, but you will also pass this acquired hair loss down to your offspring. Apparently, he believes that the real reason hair loss is so common is that men haven't been following the Ray Peat diet over the ages and then passed down this baldness trait to their offspring. So, I think we should skip over the Lysenkoism bullshit before he starts claiming that hair loss came from the lost continent of Atlantis. Let's instead move on to the last part of this feeble, sad, and pathetic video.
So let's talk about the last thing, the many paradoxes of pattern baldness. The first paradox, I think, is neonatal male pattern baldness, and this was first noticed by James B. Hamilton. He says the scalp in the first 2 years of postnatal life, soon after birth, a marked alopecia develops in the babies in the same area that becomes bald in adult men, that is the frontoparietal and frontal areas and even over the tonsure. This process continues for weeks or months and occurs in both sexes. While hairs are still being lost, new hairs appear on the surface of the scalp. By the end of the first or second year, most children have completely hairy scalp type 1 or 1.
So he brings up some supposed paradoxes to finish off the video. The first paradox is the fact that babies are often relatively bald in the first year or so of their life, but eventually they grow a full head of hair as they get older. Well, this is the first time I've ever heard anyone suggest that the lack of hair in babies has anything at all to do with androgenic alopecia. There's actually not a whole lot of studies of baby hair loss because it is a non-problem because they always end up growing a full head of hair later in their life. I've read that the causes of baby baldness may include the sudden withdrawal of estrogen when the baby leaves the mother's womb, or a kind of telogen effluvium from the stress of childbirth, as well as friction from the way the baby lies in his or her crib. But this has nothing to do with androgenic alopecia, so it hardly qualifies as a paradox.
So the next paradox is androgen insensitivity syndrome.
So he brings up androgen insensitivity syndrome again, but we've already covered that, so let's move on.
The next thing is baldness in children. We report 20 pre-pubertal children with androgenic alopecia, 12 girls and 8 boys, age range 6 to 10, observed over the last 4 years.
So here is the article on the 20 children with premature androgenic alopecia that he mentions. The children all had a very strong history of androgenic alopecia, so the genetic component was absolutely present. All the children had female pattern hair loss, not male pattern. The authors of the study proposed that these children might have had hair follicles that were extremely sensitive to androgens, which are synthesized by the adrenal glands even in young children. At any rate, this is obviously very rare. It does not contradict any of the strong evidence of the role of androgens in the progression of androgenic alopecia.
Baldness in polycystic ovarian syndrome, extremely common.
He again mentions alopecia with polycystic ovarian syndrome, but we already have seen how women with that condition have abnormally high circulating levels of androgens, so this does nothing to deny the androgen hypothesis. It only further reinforces it.
Number 6, we have the classic androgen paradox, and they say, based on these findings, DHT is held responsible for miniaturization of hair follicles and androgenic alopecia. However, as DHT is a more potent form of testosterone and androgens are expected to convert hair follicles from vellus to terminal, not the other way around, this interference gives rise to a paradox. In a review, Randall says, how one type of circulating hormone has such contrary effects on a single tissue depending on its body site is not clear. This biological paradox alone makes androgen action in hair follicles very interesting.
He brings up the androgen paradox, but this is no longer a paradox. It has been shown in the laboratory that high levels of DHT inhibit hair growth and cause the miniaturization of hair follicles. It has also been shown that hair from a balding scalp has higher levels of the 5-AR enzyme, higher levels of DHT, and an increased number of androgen receptors. Clearly, the differences in the response to DHT in the beard versus the scalp, for instance, are due to genetic differences in these different types of hair follicles. So if Danny would get out of the 1980s and look at the research done in the 2000s, then he'd realize that clearly there have been huge advances in working out the molecular basis for androgenic alopecia, and all the data supports the fact that it is due to excessive amounts of the trash hormone DHT in the scalps of people who have inherited the condition.
And the last thing that's being covered up by my graphic here is changes with season. And so this is from Aging Hair again in 2010. And they say such a marked seasonal effect is quite remarkable. Nevertheless, the effect has a major significance as any new drug or treatment should be studied for at least 1 year to separate any effect from normal seasonal variation.
So somehow the fact that there are seasonal variations in hair growth is some kind of paradox that has to do with androgenic alopecia? I'm not sure why he thinks this. Due to the cyclical nature of the hair growth cycle, people experience seasonal sheds. We all know that. And the quote here is just saying that this needs to be taken into consideration when designing drug studies. Regrowth after a seasonal shed may be one of the reasons that sometimes there is hair growth in the placebo control group of a randomized controlled drug study. So this makes perfect sense, but it has nothing at all to do with androgenic alopecia.
So that's it for this first part on hair loss, and we'll get into a second part of what I think is actually happening.
Oh my god. There's actually a part 2 of this bullshit coming up?
Fuck.
So I went ahead and skipped to the end because it's just him plugging his overpriced course and some worthless supplements again. So sorry to disappoint you chooms, but I'm probably not going to be responding to part 2. I think I have already shown sufficiently in this part that Danny Roddy's modus operandi is to take quotes out of context, misinterpret their meaning, gaslight about accepted theories of hair loss that actually exist, and then use all this to promote his business. It is all completely worthless, of course, but it is honestly exhausting refuting all of his broccoli and bullshit. And how can you even argue with someone who doesn't even believe in genes, for Ray Pete's sake? Frankly, I've got much better things to do with my time, so I'll leave Danny Roddy be so I can get back on track in examining state-of-the-art hair loss treatments that are actually based on real science and backed by the verified theory that androgenic alopecia actually is due to androgens and genetics. At the very least, Danny Roddy at least serves as a reminder of just how far someone will go to pervert science in order to better suit their agenda and confirmation bias. But in the end, the only person who stands to gain anything through the validation of Danny Roddy's theories is Danny Roddy himself. Thank you for watching Hair Loss Witchers. God bless.